there's a certain thing that happened while you were wrestling, like 2 years in your career. Uh, you receive a kick from Bubba Ray Dudley. I believe it was at the Royal Rumble, and that led to 1 year of headaches and head trauma and uncomfortable things in your life. Uh, how did that concussion happen? Like, was it a stiff move from Bubba Ray? Was it an accident? And how do you felt, knowing that your life changed forever?
Yeah, it's sort of unfair to call it a stiff kick because I mean it was a boot in the corner that I ran into, and I was running. It was a very quiet house show, and so we were all sort of moving a little faster than usual to try to bring in energy, and I was closer to his foot than I maybe usually was, and so it just sort of took my head off, and I had a bad concussion, but didn't appreciate how bad it was. So I kept wrestling, not only that night, but for weeks, and developed permanent post-concussion syndrome, headaches, nausea when I worked out for a decade. And I was in so much pain that I couldn't get in the ring. And then after that pain lasted for more than a year, I realized I couldn't live the rest of my life like that. So if I got better, I wasn't going to put myself at risk like that again.
Translate that. Cuando ocurre el accidente, la conmoción cerebral, obviamente fue una patada stiff que él corrió y se llevó en la cara mientras Baba estaba en la esquina. Obviamente comienza a sufrir de CTE, producto de esa conmoción cerebral, y las náuseas mientras estaba haciendo ejercicio, los dolores de cabeza. Él siguió luchando, no por días, sino por varias semanas, hasta que él dice como que ya, o sea, no puedo hacer esto nada más, el mismo médico se lo dijo, y de ahí pues en adelante él toma la decisión de retirarse. So once you retired, why do you decided that CTE was the thing you wanted to study? Because at that point, it was considered by many so-called experts like a fictional disease, but you were one of the guys that proved that it is not fictional. It was just not studied yet.
Yeah, so my first passion was actually to change how we talked about concussions. So I learned that I sort of threw away my brain health because I was ignorant about the fact that those times I was kicked in the head and forgot where I was meant I had a concussion and I needed time off to recover. And so initially the idea was I'll write a book about how we should be handling concussions different in sports and wrestling and everywhere so that others like me, and there were a lot of people I had met over time, didn't throw away their health, just because they didn't know. And then CTE, happened to be diagnosed in the first two NFL players, like at that time. I wrote a chapter about it in the book, but realized that CT was the way to get people to care about concussions, even not knowing how big CT was, because it provided pictures of the damage. Concussions are invisible. And then once we started digging into CTE more, and I sort of created the outreach to families of athletes to donate their brain, we realized, okay, CT is its own problem and it needs its own approach, which will be slightly different than concussions.
Translate that. Su pasión inicialmente comenzó hablando de lo que eran las conmociones cerebrales, porque él las sufrió obviamente en aquellos momentos con dolores de cabeza, con náuseas, sin saber en dónde estaba, completamente perdida la noción del tiempo, y eventualmente comienza a improvisar esto, a improve, a mejorar, y decide entonces evaluar lo que es el CTE desde la perspectiva de que, ok, la conmoción cerebral no se puede mostrar en fotos, pero el daño causado a través del CTE sí se puede, y ahí entonces él toma la decisión de dar un paso más adelante, pese a que en aquel momento habían personas como que no creían en eso. How did the Concussion Legacy Foundation happen, and how did it ended up partnering with Boston University as a part of it?
So the book came out in fall 2006. Nothing happened. We couldn't get media to cover the concussion story. And then Andre Waters, a former NFL player, took his life, and I took it upon myself to procure his brain for research, and also made the deal that if it turned out to be positive, we wouldn't wait for a medical article to come out a year later, but we would tell the lay press so that families could understand that this is real. And so it became a front page story on the New York Times in January 2007. And then suddenly the floodgates opened, players started coming forward, or we convinced some players to come forward. We found another a CT case in Justin Strelzik. And I realized that, you know, brain donation was going to keep this going, but we needed to do it. At that point, I was just a guy calling families, sending them to a doctor they've never heard of. And I said, we need to not only make sure people know this is nonprofits, no one's profiting from giving a brain, but also partner with a real strong academic research group who would use this tissue to eventually learn how to cure this disease. And I was very lucky to be introduced to Bob Stern and Ann McKee at Boston University, who were both willing to sort of change their careers from being focused on Alzheimer's which is a very similar disease, to CTE. And we also partnered with the VA, where the brains actually sit. And, you know, it's been a wonderful relationship now going on 13 years.
En el 2006, cuando todo ocurrió con la historia de la conmoción cerebral, como que nada pasó porque no pudo conseguir las personas que cubrieran y los medios de comunicación que cubrieran esa historia. Con el pasar de los tiempos ocurrió un suceso muy lamentable en donde Andre, jugador de fútbol, cometió suicidio, y él le toca hacer la llamada a la mamá y decirle, mira, necesito que nos dones el cerebro de tu hijo para poder entonces investigar las causas del CTI. Esto va a ser por una buena causa, esto va a ser para evitar que esto vuelva a ocurrir, y así es que comienza todo, y de esa manera hay otras personas que comienzan entonces a donar su cerebro, o a pledge, como él dice, a donar su cerebro posterior a su muerte, para ser investigadas las causas del CTE y poder hacer todo este tipo de investigación. Y eventualmente conoce a dos personas de Boston University y comienzan entonces un partnership, y tienes a una universidad académica que son fuertes en research, en investigación científica, y a su vez entonces tienes esta fundación libre de como tal, non-profitable, que ellos están buscando ayudar a las personas y poder investigar más sobre esta causa. How did you manage, because this is the hardest part of it, like now highly probably you have someone, you know, working on it, but at the beginning you had to make the difficult calls to the family members to say, hey, I know your son, I know your daughter or whoever died, but we need his or her brain to do scientific studies in order to avoid this to keep happening. So to you as a human being, to Dr. Christopher Nowinski, how did you felt, you know, calling those people, because that was highly probably the difficult part of the job?
Yeah, it was at the beginning, I would become very anxious, very nervous, and I'd always question whether it was, you know, fair or right to make these calls. And it was only by making those calls that I learned that families were usually incredibly appreciative that I cared enough about what happened to their husband or father or son to make that call. You know, a lot of these families watch their loved ones suffer, and they wanted answers, and they wanted someone to learn from this. So there were only been a couple instances where families were upset when I called, and it was usually when they lost their child. And I, as a parent, I can understand that. But most people have been, you know, we wouldn't be at 1,000 brains donated if it wasn't for the incredible families we've met along the way.
Translate that to Spanish. La parte más difícil del trabajo en un principio era, y obviamente se sentía mal, se sentía incómodo haciéndolo, pero había que llamar a la familia para pedirle que donaran el cerebro de su hijo o de su hija para poder investigar estas causas, para poder evitar que esto continúe pasando. Y obviamente el motivo era excelente, pero el proceso era difícil. Habían personas sí que se molestaban, sobre todo cuando era un niño o una niña, pero si no fuese por este tipo de acciones y de acercamientos, no hubiesen tenido 1,000 cerebros donados para entonces poder hacer este tipo de estudios y poder ayudar a salvar vidas.